The young face of Mexico's old party. Can Enrique Peña Nieto win back the presidency for the PRI, which controlled Mexican politics for 70 years? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Mexico's presidential campaign is underway. For the next 3 months, 3 candidates will make their case to the Mexican people, all of them promising change as Mexico struggles with a deadly war with drug cartels and a troubled economy. So far, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, that for decades ruled Mexico with an iron fist, appears to be poised for a comeback. It's known as the party of dinosaurs, but its current candidate is a 45-year-old who's appealing to younger voters. Polls show Enrique Peña Nieto with a comfortable lead over his rivals. Part of Peña Nieto's appeal rides on widespread discontent with President Felipe Calderón's conservative National Action Party, or the PAN. During Calderón's term, more than 50,000 people have been killed due to drug violence. The PAN's candidate, Josefina Vázquez Mota, is currently in second place, according to recent polls. In third place is the candidate representing a coalition of left-wing parties, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He lost the last election by less than 1% of the vote. So how is it that the PRI candidate is in the lead this time around? Frank Concheras explains.
At this early stage in Mexico's presidential campaign, most polls show the clear frontrunner is Enrique Peña Nieto. He's the telegenic candidate of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, a party born into power in 1929 following the Mexican Revolution. The PRI governed Mexico oftentimes with an iron fist for 71 consecutive years. It lost the presidency in the year 2000 when a candidate for the National Action Party beat the PRI for the first time in a presidential contest. Since then, Mexicans have had 2 consecutive presidencies under the National Action Party. But under the PAN governments, including President Felipe Calderón, more than 50,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence. And there's a general sense that Mexicans' economic situation is worse off under the PAN. So this helps to explain the widespread disenchantment that many Mexicans feel with PAN governments, and also explains why they're possibly ready to see power return to the PRI, a party that ruled with corruption and election vote fraud, but also the country's most experienced political organization. It has a great presence in the Congress and the Senate, and holds 20 of Mexico's 32 states in the governorships. For that reason, many Mexicans say they're willing to return to the devil they know.
So, what is fueling the resurgence of the PRI, and what will it mean for the country's troubled economy and its deadly drug war? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Rodolfo, Latin America analyst and contributor to Foreign Policy in Focus; by George Grayson, he's professor of Latin American politics at the College of William and Mary; and from Mexico City, we're joined by Fernanda Salazar, a PRI supporter and advisor. Fernanda Salazar, there is the charge, though, that nothing's changed with the PRI. They've simply nominated a charismatic figurehead. This is all simply about getting power back. It's not about proper institutional reform within the party.
Well, I don't think that's quite true, because the PRI has learned a big lesson from 2006 election, where they went up to 3rd place with a very low voting. And after that, the PRI learned on the first place that the party needs to be united in order to win. And that has forced an internal process to build agreements among the different currents inside the party. There are still some things that have to be made, like fighting corruption within the party, and some public figures.
All right then, Professor Grayson, before we look at some of those, we look at whether PRI has actually really changed. Help us understand how the PRI managed to have such a grip over Mexican politics for 70 years.
Well, it was analogous to Tammany Hall that used to control New York. like a fiefdom. And the PRI corrupted every segment of society, whether it was education, whether it was petroleum, whether it was electricity. And of course, they also cut deals with the large narco traffickers. And so there were rules of the game established. And as long as the interlocutor with the PRI obeyed the rules of the game, things were fine. But let's say a cartel leader began killing civilians, which was against the rules of the game, the PRI would come down on him like a ton of bricks. And so there were constraints on all elements of society, including the drug mafias.
But how do they maintain power, Rodolfo Pastor? I mean, it's not as if Mexico, in return, received enormous development and that poverty was eradicated. It's not Singapore or something. I mean, how do they maintain that power despite the fact that Mexico's inequalities remain pretty much the same?
I think it goes back to what maybe Don Porfirio might have said. You know, it's about order and progress. And the PRI made sure that there was order and progress, even if it was relative, even if it was also linked to profound inequality and poverty. And of course, pacts had to be made. And I think that besides the wonderful discourse that Peña Nieto, as a fresh face, as a telegenic candidate, is making right now, there is this off-the-record message by the PRI to Mexicans: listen, we may be corrupt, we may be authoritarian, but we're going to take care of things. We're going to make sure things work again.
Ideologically, though, was there any particular line? I mean, certainly at the beginning, it seemed the PRI embodied some of the ideals of the Mexican Revolution, of nationalization and mobilization of agrarian communities and so forth, but that seemed to go by the wayside as the 70 years continued.
The PRI is the hole in the donut in terms of ideology. It always stood for what the incumbent president of the nation, provided he was a priest, stood for. So they favored having a corporatist system where people were represented through their occupation. That was the late 1930s. Carlos Salinas comes along in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and says, now we're going to go to a free market system. We're going to negotiate the free trade agreement. So it was whatever the incumbent president of the nation said was their ideology, that was it.
Fernanda Salazar, then, I mean, there is that acceptance then of this corruption within the new generation of the PRI, that frankly every president simply nominated his successor and that was that, and then the corrupt levers of power remained in place. I mean, that's accepted now by the PRI, is it?
No, well, first of all, I would say that we cannot speak of a single PRI, like, not, on the first place, not a single PRI during 70 years, and not a single PRI now. And I would say that's one of the main challenges of the PRI, that it still remain, because along history there have been a lot of internal issues for the PRI to solve before going outside and face competition. So I think there's clearly a wing in the PRI that has been trying to foster a transition that has not been concluded, and that the PAN has not been able to give to the people and to the institutions. And we can prove that by saying that the political reform has been presented by the PRI in the Mexican Senate.
The PRI suffered a number of body blows. For example, there was a massacre of students and young people on October 2nd, 1968. Then the PRI was absolutely impotent when there were terrible earthquakes in September of 1985. And then the election of 1988, in which Carlos Salinas allegedly beat Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, was just shrouded in shadows. But the knockout blow came with the December crisis of 1996, when the peso was devalued by about a half, and the poor people continued to live from hand to mouth. The rich got their dollars out of the country, but the middle class really suffered, turned against the PRI, and began electing PRI officials at the local level, state level, and then Vicente Fox in 2000.
You mean PAN at the local PAN officials at the local. Rodolfo Pastor, then, Fernanda is putting a case there that there was some process of change then, and there were wings, of course, of the PRI. And perhaps there's not even one pre-party as such. Perhaps the whole conceptual framework is slightly wrong. But are the same people effectively in charge of the PRI, or has there been a major change?
I think that's an excellent question. I do agree with Fernanda. You have to understand that the PRI as a political party is much more complex than a monolithic organization. And I'm sure that there is a reformist wing within the PRI. We also saw the assassination of Colosio in 1994, who was a reformer. And then, you know, the imposition of a PRI candidate and the last president for PRI, Cedillo. So what I would like to see for these elections is beyond Peña Nieto. Who is in charge of this magnificent machine that is the PRI? I mean, it is a corporation. They do have power in many of the states around the country, but is there a substantive change behind Peña Nieto?
Well, let's take a look at Peña Nieto, actually. We have a statement he recently made about his general sort of ideals. Let's take a listen to what he said.
It's very clear what Mexico demands to achieve these objectives and bring down the biggest complaint for Mexicans, the biggest demands and the feelings of frustrations that millions of Mexicans suffer from. Mexicans want a change. Mexicans want a responsible change with a clear course and want to be protagonist of the new alternative that brings better conditions to Mexico.
Professor Grayson, I mean, perhaps we're being unfair, but that was an immensely general statement by Peña Nieto. And it adds to, I mean, there are some who think that he's not necessarily somebody who's this great political mind that people might be pulling his strings. Some people actually say that the former President Salinas might be pulling the strings, actually, frankly. And famously, he's unable to say anything other than slogans. If he's asked, you know, what books influenced him, he hasn't a clue, you know, in a sort of very sort of Sarah Palin-y kind of way. What do you make of him?
Well, he's a media candidate, but he's got excellent advisors. Why they would take him to a book fair when that was going to be a hostile audience is beyond my conception. But I think Mexico has what Southern Baptists in this country call backslid. That is, they've had a reverse in democracy because they have fair elections now. But the power has gravitated from Mexico City to the states, and the governors rule their states like fiefdoms. And there really is no way that the average Mexican citizen can influence an incumbent office holder, not to mention a corrupt judiciary, corrupt police force, and a corrupt educational system.
So, but then why then would the Mexican people turn back to the PRI of all people then to try and correct that, Rodolfo Pastor?
I think that's exactly what they're betting on. I mean, they're betting on the people's fear. They're betting on the fact that President Calderon and his government and 12 years of PAN have not made a difference. You still have corruption. You still have a weak economy. You still have poverty, inequality. They've been growing in Mexico as compared to the rest of the region. So what the PRI is betting on here is, you know, let's get back to what we know is works, has worked before. And I think the very interesting issue here is he is the front runner. He's got a significant
But do you believe
lead.
he's in control? I mean, he will be the decider if he was president, or are there people pulling his strings?
Absolutely not. I think it's the party that's in control, and I think that he's just a very attractive
and
candidate.
then so that's the central party machinery, and then connected then to the governorships and the regional. I mean, how does all that fit together?
Yes. Well, the PRI as a party, as a national party, does garner support and resources from state governments in power.
I don't want to be an apologist for Peña Nieto and the PRI, but something I've noticed is that Peña Nieto realizes his shortcomings. He knows that he's not Einstein, and therefore he has assembled quite an attractive group of advisors, and I think he's listening to them more than more, especially after several gaffes have taken place.
So I guess that all comes down to then specifics, which we'll look at in a moment. Yes, sorry, Fernanda, do go ahead. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I see nothing wrong in having like a very good group of advisors. Actually, one of the weakest points in Felipe Calderon government is that he's known by placing his best friends around him in key positions to deal with public policies. And that's why he has not given the correct solutions to the Mexicans' problems. I think that whenever you have good institutions, you may be not the best man, not the best academic person, but if you do have strong institutions, if you do have a strong character and a good mind, a clear mind to know what you can do and expect from the best what they have to do, then you can build a very good government.
Sort of a managerial kind of role. Yeah.
I mean,
we need to move on.
Democracy cannot depend.
We just need to move on a bit. We are beginning to run out of time, but and we'll get on to actually the specific differences then between the candidates on matters of substance, the economy and the drug war. But very quickly, it's very difficult to talk about Mexico without talking about the US. It'd be absurd not to mention the US. It's interesting the US does favor the PAN candidate. Is that simply because of extreme neoliberal orthodoxy, or what? I mean, why is the US all for?
Listen, the US takes no official position on candidates. It would be the kiss of death if any official in the United States were to
but the preference would appear to be, though, for the PAN candidate. Wouldn't that be correct, Rodolfo?
Beyond the official, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there is clear support for the official stance for the government right now, for the government's policies, especially when it comes to security, which is a main U.S. interest. I suppose
it's partly because there are more local factors at play for the PRI that perhaps the U.S. doesn't necessarily get, or isn't assured it's going to get everything that it necessarily wants from the Mexican government in that scenario.
My impression, and I've talked to Peña Nieto about this, as I was telling Queen Elizabeth yesterday, I hate name droppers, but he wants to continue cordial relations with the U.S., including in the anti-drug and military sphere. He's also worried sick about what's happening in Guatemala and the spillover of illegal immigrants into Mexico, and also the growing power of the drug cartels, not only in his country, but also in Central America.
All right, we've got to keep this moving then. So the drugs issue we'll get to in a moment, but first of all, let's deal with the economy. Mexico's economy grew over the past 2 years after plunging 6% in 2009. The country's GDP grew by more than 5% in 2010, but by less than 4% last year. As many as 47% of the population struggles with poverty. The number of those living below the poverty line increased by more than 3 million between 2008 and 2010. The official unemployment rate is just over 5%, but underemployment could be as high as 25%. Rodolfo, Pastor, looking at those two main parties, do they offer any significant differences on the economy, or is it simply the usual mishmash of neoliberal orthodoxy and privatization and trickle-down economics?
One of the most surprising things that I've seen observing these elections and this campaign going on right now is how similar the proposals from both PAN and PRI candidates are. It's pretty much a replica in terms of economic reform, in terms of what to do with the issues of security. They're betting on a continuation, if not a regression. And I do think that PRD right here and Andrés Manuel as the presidential candidate does have a significantly different.
But why isn't he in third place, a distant third to the front runner?
I think it's a confrontation of powers within Mexico, and it's clear that the media and the political elite and the elite in general is backing both the official candidate, Josefina Vázquez Mota, and the PAN, and of course Peña Nieto, who is the candidate. He is publicly known as the candidate of the media.
But Obrador is often dismissed, but was he ever even that radical in the first place? I mean, of course, he's stressing that he'll be more Lula than Chavez and so forth, but he was never hugely a firebrand.
No, his outlook was the pre-outlook of the 1970s. That is, big government, welfare system, resisting integration with the international economy.
Which someone might argue was the right system, given how disastrous the global financial system ended up with the neoliberal model.
He's not a radical.
Right.
He's just an old-time priesta. And because he was brought up in the PRI, he was the state president of the PRI in Tabasco.
What about other? I mean, there is a sense that there are other civil society groups now, the Indignados and the peace movement and so forth. Might they not have a role in this? Basically, a pox on everyone's houses because there isn't any alternative on the economy. Is there any truth in that, or is that overstated?
I think none of the three main proposals and candidates here are making the right decisions in terms of what can they do to improve conditions for the majority of Mexicans. I do think that López Obrador does have a long record in terms of reforming both within the PRI and then as a founder of the modern Mexican democratic movement. And I mean, you cannot put aside that trajectory. But I do think that there's an issue here in terms of addressing structural issues that have been systematically neglected.
And actually, go ahead, yes, Fernanda.
I would like to point out that whenever the left-wing party or almost whenever the National Action Party has governed a local state, the PRI has also come back. So there's this thing that we cannot ignore, that about efficient governments, and those governments in specific areas like Michoacán, like nowadays Guerrero, which is governed by a coalition between left-wing party and right-wing party that we don't understand at all, is governing, and it's not doing a good job in Guerrero. So I do think that we are kind of missing that citizens are not full people, and they do know when they get what they expect from a government.
Just briefly, there's a poet essayist named Javier Cecilia. His son was brutally tortured and murdered. He led parades all around Mexico City, and there's been no change in policy since then. That is, the average citizen, even someone who's a distinguished intellectual, can't affect the behavior of incumbent politicians in Mexico.
Well, let's take a look at the drug war, which is usually how Mexico gets international news attention. President Calderon's use of the military against Mexico's drug gangs has led to the deaths of at least 50,000 in the past 5 years. But it seems that none of the leading candidates would change policy dramatically. Josefina Vázquez Mota, the candidate of Calderon's party, says she plans to continue the war on the cartels, including the use of the military. The PRI's, or rather PRI's candidate, Enrique Peña Nieto, has proposed gradually withdrawing the Mexican military and reinstating police authority. He has, however, been vague about a specific timetable. Andrés Manuel López Obrador of the PRD says he'll pull the Mexican military out within 6 months of his election. He would also rely on state and local police forces, but given how much of an emergency it would appear to be in Mexico, with so many dying, so much corruption, is that a bit of a surprise, Rodolfo Pastor, that no one's coming out with any radical proposals? President Fox, the former president, is now talking about legalization of drugs, for example. These don't seem to be issues that are being dealt with.
I think it's very important to understand the critical context that Mexico is in right now. And from such a critical context, you do have, first of all, the triumph of fear and conservatism in terms of, well, let's not do anything that might make this worse. But at the same moment, I do think you have, coming from the political class, a responsibility in proposing new and radically different policies that might address this issue.
Professor Grayson, as part of that let's leave it to us, we'll sort it out, there is that suggestion that part of that is, as long as the bribes are paid and a lid is kept on drug violence, then perhaps the drug cartels will be allowed to do what they have to do, or what they feel they have to do. Is that unfair?
I think at the state level, many of the governors are either joined at the hip with the cartel, the local cartel, or they've turned a blind eye to fighting the cartels. But the overall problem is you can't win a drug war, and you certainly can't win a drug war with the army. You need to have capable, specialized, effective police.
Right, but is the choice there at the moment, though, between a PAN, which will carry on Calderon's crackdown, which many would argue has failed, or the PRI, which will offer the equilibrium of old, where not too many people get killed, and everything just works under the surface, basically, but as long as the US continues to have its drug demand, there's frankly nothing Mexico can do, so let's just live with it.
I think either party, if it wins, will reduce the military presence. At the same time, I think they will rely less on the Army and more on the Navy, which has been quite successful in fighting the cartels. There's also talk by Peña Nieto of forming a Department of Homeland Security, of forming a Mexican version of the DEA. But again, the bottom line is, unless you've got capable, effective, honest police, you're not going to be able to wage a successful war against street walking or drug selling.
All right, we'll leave it there then. Thank you very much, Professor George Grayson, Rodolfo Pastor, and Fernanda Salazar in Mexico City. Thank you very much. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.